Welcome again to Lakeshore Focus, a weekly show highlighting the key issues, important events, and interesting people in our region. I'm Keith Kirkpatrick. Dan Lowery was the host of Lakeshore Focus from its first broadcast in February of 2007 until his departure in November of 2010. For nearly 4 years, his face, along with his weekly guest, was the image of Lakeshore Focus. Dan's sharp wit, challenging questions, and candid remarks were the hallmark of his much-watched show in our region. Let's welcome back the fabulous former host of Lakeshore Focus, Dan Lowery.
Those are very kind words, Keith. Thank you.
Didn't you like all that flowery stuff?
That was terrific. Okay.
But you deserved it. You deserved it.
Well, I had my moments. Okay.
Well, I thought we would just, take some time. You haven't been on the show. Well, I had you on about a year and a half or so ago.
It's been probably a couple years.
Yeah. So it was time to get you back. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about the show because we're approaching, I guess, 8 or 9 years of the show at this point.
Isn't that terrific? So congratulations on your tenure, by the way.
Oh, well, thanks.
So I was glad you were selected for this because I knew that the station wanted to appeal to an older demographic.
Was that what it was?
And I knew that you would be able to accomplish that, a more senior presence.
So you're trying to say this gray hair for you came on much after the show? Because I looked at some of the reruns, and I'm pretty sure it was still gray back then.
Very good, okay.
But I brought something with you. I want maybe you to hold this this card up, if I can get it here for you. Let's see. Yeah, you can hold that card up. So Dan, what do you think that number is?
188.
Well, you're good with the numbers.
Or 881.
Well, it's the other way.
All right, very good.
And you know what that is? That represents?
Is that the number of shows?
That's the number of shows that you did.
Very good.
When you were here. Let's see what my card has to say. Oh, 199.
199.
Well, hold your number up so we can compare these. Now, I know you're a college president, and you can see that mine is
I will point
somewhat
out
greater.
that it took me less time to get it right.
So tell me, speaking of getting it right, do you remember your first show?
You know, it's all kind of a blur, I have to tell you. I know that I was incredibly nervous about the show. I wanted to do it right. What I learned very quickly when I was doing the show is how much it takes to actually do a TV show. And the young professionals who were working here, particularly in the news programs, I grew to having a great appreciation for the skill that they demonstrated in putting a show together. I found out things very quickly right from that first show that I wasn't particularly good on reading on a teleprompter. That I would stumble on my words and that I would forget questions and mangle the language. And there are some people who are really good at this, and there's some people that aren't so good at this. I had to work very, very hard to try to do a credible show.
It's the nerve thing. I think it's the nerve thing for me too, because when I first started, you and I talked a little bit because when I was asked to do this, I called you up and we chatted a couple times, like, give me some pointers, because I'd never done TV before. And I remember you telling me a few things, but still, when I got in here and you see the people giving you the hand signals and the crew in the back, and they are working really hard. It's a little nerve-wracking to keep track of everything when you're doing that.
Well, I can tell you the worst mistake we ever made, and unfortunately, it involved live television. But we were doing the gubernatorial debate for all of the public TV stations in the state of Indiana, and I was asked as the host of Lakeshore Focus to do that. And so it was being aired all over the state. And here I was the host, and I was watching the representatives from the League of Women Voters who were keeping time. I was listening to the questions that were being asked by the press. I was looking at hand signals from an individual here at the station. But then in my ear, I was listening to my daughter-in-law, Amy Lowery, who was actually the producer of the show. And somewhere along the line, I realized that I forgot to ask a question or to give the governor an opportunity, Governor Mitch Daniels, an opportunity to answer the question. And he called me on it. And he said, Mr. Lowery, what about my chance to answer the question? And I heard in my ear, I heard my daughter-in-law say, yes, Dad, you just skipped the governor. So there were those kinds of moments that did occur.
Did you have many more than that? Because you asked me before we even started if I've had those moments, and and I can't, off the top of my head, think
Well,
about
as
it.
you know, the beauty of this show is that it's taped in advance.
Yes.
And so we were able to clean up a lot of the errors that actually occurred. And that happened a lot, particularly when we were doing the other thoughts segment at the end, the op-ed piece that we did each week. Because reading on a teleprompter really takes a lot of skill. You've got to get the rhythm of your speech just right.
Now that's interesting because they don't allow me that privilege.
Is that right?
We just tape straight through, and they say if I mess up, I just mess up. It'll just add to the humor of the show. So
Well, ours was
that's because you had Amy helping you.
I had Amy helping me, and she didn't want the family to be embarrassed.
So she could make you look good each week.
She tried.
Well,
She did her best.
Well, that's good. Do you have one interview that was kind of stands out to you as pretty memorable, or?
Well, I had a number of memorable guests, and the guests made the show. As you know, it's the guests who really make the show. I think we had Governor Mitch Daniels. I already mentioned his name on the show a couple of times. Those were great interviews. They were always great interviews because he was so direct in responding. Another set of shows, I think we did 2 or 3 of these shows, where I would have Mayor McDermott, the mayor of Hammond, on, and John Costas, the mayor of Valparaiso. And what made those shows so memorable is they actually enjoyed each other. They had a great deal in common that they shared. One's a Republican, one's a Democrat, one's from an urban community, one's from more of a suburban community. But they really appreciated each other, and those shows were very engaging, but it was because of their relationship that made it engaging. What would usually happen when they were on the show is they would stick around for another 45 minutes, and the show would actually continue without being taped. They would just enjoy each other's company so much.
I've found that a lot of really good stuff is said kind of after the camera goes off.
That's right.
And in fact, we shot a show maybe a year ago about gangs, and I had someone on from the works with gangs out of the Sheriff's Department in Lake County, and a former gang member. And what they talked about after the show, and we actually taped it, and it's on the website. There's a little 45-second segment because Tom Branson shared what it was like to go to a crime scene and talk to a mother whose son had just been killed.
Sure.
And he got very emotional about that.
Right.
And those emotional moments are pretty powerful.
Those are powerful. We did a few shows on tragedies that occurred in the region, particularly crime tragedies involving children, and those couldn't help but choke you up. Also, those I often feature those in the Other Thoughts segment as well, touched on those issues. I mean, the show that most people seem to remember, however, and I still get asked by it at least 3-4 times a year, is a show we had on with Spiros Batastatos, and it had to do with the Regional Transportation Authority. And Dennis Rittenmeyer, my former boss as president of Calumet College of St. Joseph, was also head of the Regional Bus Authority, the
right.
RBA at that time. And the Regional Bus Authority was advocating for a food and beverage tax to pay for a public transportation system. And the leading advocate against that position was Spiros Batastatos, and he and I had a rather contentious show. But
I actually heard that when I came on board. Right. They said, Dan had a really interesting show one time with Spiros.
It was very interesting, and part of the reason it was contentious is it wasn't so much, I was perfectly happy with disagreeing with people on their perspectives, but I thought some of the arguments that were being made were very disingenuous and really quite unfair. It was about winning as opposed to shedding light on an important public policy issue in the region. So that was an interesting show, and that's probably the most, maybe not the most memorable show to me, but I think the one that people remember the most. How about yours? What do you get feedback on?
Same kind of thing, and we're now able to put a lot of the old shows on YouTube.
Right.
In fact, I think we've got almost 90 shows on YouTube at this point, and so I'm able to actually go back and look at the views. And
right.
One of the most viewed shows is the one I did with a doctor who's from Syria and his daughter, and they had talked about going into the refugee camps in Syria during these last few years, trying to find his lost family, and that was a very emotional show too. You're right, those emotions, if they get in there, are good. The other is when that chemistry is really good between your guest.
The most emotional show for me personally, actually involved Bill Smith, who's the official photographer for both the Bears and the Bulls. I mean, he's well known as a photographer. But he has a private charity that he created that works with orphans in Cambodia who lived on this large municipal garbage dump. They lived on the dump. And he and a few of his associates created a nonprofit to educate these children, to get them off of the dump. But he came one day, he was on the show, and he shared a lot of the pictures that he had taken there. And of course, these are professional quality pictures. But, you know, those just grabbed your heart and twisted it, you know. But I was so impressed by his commitment, his generosity, and his passion about this particular charity. I mean, it was a pretty amazing moment, I think, in the 4 years of the show.
Some of the guests I've had that have been from out of the area have been really pretty fascinating too.
Yes.
I think I had a woman whose sister was one of the little girls killed in Montgomery, Alabama, in the bombing. That was a very emotional show, her talking about that experience. She actually was born, I think, after it, but it was always in the family and everything.
You know, it's always the stories that get people. You know, if you've got a compelling story, that's what really grabs the viewers.
Right.
And it stirs
And trying
a
to
lot
get
of
those to
interest.
come out.
That's right.
Every once in a while, it's a little hard to pull it out of some people,
Right.
isn't it?
Right, it is. You know, for most of us, you know, if you're not Donald Trump, you're not used to comfortable talking about yourself, okay? And so sometimes people are quite reserved. You'll hear them say something like this, well, I was there at the moment, and that's how I had to respond, you know, particularly in those stories of heroism. And so they tend to downplay their accomplishments. But if you can get out those stories, people have a way of relating to them. And
you know, it's really interesting in this whole dialogue we're having. You know, I feel like I'm still asking the questions.
Right.
You know, and I wonder if it's because I'm in this seat or it's the rhythm of what you do. So, you know, you used to sit in this seat, so I think we should trade seats. So you're in front of the
Let's try.
Focus and see what happens. So.
now the world looks completely different from here.
Does it? What's
does.
it look like?
It looks completely different. Now I see you not as an authority figure, but as a guest.
Oh, well, I was hoping you would see me as a friend too, but
Yeah, very
you know,
good.
It does feel different sitting here to me. I'm not sure why.
Well, probably is, and this is the experience of hosting a show like this. You feel a high level of responsibility to the viewers. You want to do a good quality job. You want the show to be somehow enlightening, to have some real information. So it may be that you're feeling a little bit less a sense of responsibility for the overall product that we have here today.
That could be. So, you know, at the end of the show, you and I both always ask for feedback about the shows. Do you remember a specific feedback where you're like, oh my gosh, you know, I can't believe they said that, or just something you were kind of thrown off by, or?
Well, the most feedback I ever got was whenever I would do an op-ed, another thoughts piece at the end having to do with guns. And I did look for opportunities when there was, and we've had so many of these tragic killings in this country, that I would look for opportunities to speak to that issue. You know, my own belief is that there's a better way than what we're doing right now. You know, we are now having so many of these awful shootings that we've kind of become immune to that sense of regret, tragedy.
Well, I know you were always better at it than I know that I am, of really putting your opinion very strongly out there. And that's kind of where you got some of that feedback, because you would say, this is what I
Well,
believe.
I would, but I have to tell you, the gun lobby out there is everywhere. And there is no rational debate with them whatsoever on this issue. You know, you'll probably get some good feedback on the remarks that I'm making right now. It's some of the most unreasoned positions I've ever seen. But I would always get a lot of incredibly negative feedback after that, called everything from un-American to uninformed and so on and so forth. It was not well-reasoned, but that's where most of the negative feedback would come from.
I had an email from someone one time who said, and I won't say who this was or what show it was, but you know, So who were the two bimbos on your show? They ought to ask the college that they went to for a refund.
Oh, well, that's not so good.
It was
That's
really
not so
harsh. It was really harsh.
That's a little harsh.
Yeah, and I was like, and these were two very well-spoken
Yeah.
women who I thought knew what they were talking about, but they must have really hit a chord with somebody that didn't like what they had
Well,
to say.
inevitably, and or invariably, this kind of negative feedback came as anonymous. They wouldn't put a name to it. Okay, which if you're gonna make tough statements, you ought to have the courage or the character to put your name to it, I think. So.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. I don't know that I get as strong an opinion, because in the show, as you've given, maybe mine's a little more subtle, because you do get a chance to kind of lace in your thoughts into, even by the questions you ask.
Well, I did, when I was doing the show, Keith, I always did try to separate my own personal opinions from the interview. The exception to that was probably the Batistatos interview, where I felt that the situation required some rebuttal to take place there, because I thought that the arguments being made were somewhat disingenuous. But normally speaking, I was always very deferential of the guest. And the goal here was not, I'm not a journalist, so it was not gotcha journalism by a long shot, but it's to help the guest tell their story. And so I saw that. Now, once I got to the other thoughts piece, here's my opinion.
Did you usually try to tie those to the topic?
I did not, for the very reason that we're talking about right now. I didn't want there to be any confusion between the two.
That's interesting. That's really different than what I'm doing, because I always try to tie mine right to that.
Right.
For kind of a blend, I guess.
Sure.
But do you see any differences in what I do versus what you did besides that?
Mine was probably, I would say, and you might have a very different opinion about this, but although I'm not a journalist, I did try to take somewhat of a journalistic slant on things. The guests I selected came out of the newspaper. Okay, that's where I identified guests. So I tried to make it related to current events. Now, obviously, I veered off from that, quite a bit at the time. I know, that one of my favorite shows, every calendar quarter, at the end of every calendar quarter, we did a news roundup and I would have a panel that would include typically a reporter from the Times or the Post-Tribune, from the station itself. But I'd have a group of journalists, and we would walk through what's the biggest story. What's the story of the next calendar quarter that we ought to keep an eye on. So I stayed pretty close, I think, if you would look at the 4 years worth of shows. I kept them pretty much focused on the news.
I think that I do that at the end of the year with Jerry Davich and Krista Zivanovic, so kind of
Jerry was a guest, great guest. Krista was always a terrific guest as well.
They're really good together. They have good chemistry.
Yep. Bill Nangle was a terrific guest when we would do those roundup shows. And Bill was terrific because he didn't pull any punches. He went right to it, and it was always a great guest.
He has such historic perspective on everything too,
yes.
which is really cool. So are you ready to come back and do the show again at some point?
Well, I once you get it right, and I think you're good for another 4 years.
You think so?
Another 4 years, and then we can kind of consider that. Actually, my day job is keeping me pretty involved. I did decide very early on, once I became selected as president of Calumet College of St. Joseph, that doing editorials on a public television show and being president of a college didn't work very well
That was
together.
when you made your decision pretty much to depart from the show.
That's it. It was when I moved into that position. And so, and it was the right decision to make at the time, but I have to say, and I'm sure this is true for you, it's a great honor to be able to do a show like this, to share your thoughts with the citizens of Northwest Indiana and even into Illinois. It's a terrific responsibility, but it's a wonderful opportunity. Most people don't get that opportunity.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating too. I was just thinking, was there something on the show during the whole time where you went, wow, I just didn't know that at all? I mean, that was a big revelation to you of something that just really kind of the dots connected or something for you on a
You know,
topic?
I don't recall a moment quite like that. Probably because I took more of a news format, I knew a little bit about the story that was going to be told. So I don't remember quite a revelation of that type. I can tell you one of the most humorous moments we ever had on the show, and it was actually 2 shows. It was one of the first shows we did. It was in the spring of 2007, and Don Coffin, the economist we both know
Right.
from, now retired from Indiana University Northwest. Now you have to remember, this is the spring of 2007, and Don was giving an economic outlook for the coming year, and Don's a friend, and I'm not picking on Don so much, but on his whole profession, the economics profession. And Don was telling me everything's rosy, and I said, Don, how can you say everything's rosy? Credit card debt is really high, that money is getting tighter, that unemployment is very high. And I went through a series of 8 or 9 statistics, and he said, don't worry about it, everything is fine. And of course, the crash in 2008, when we went into the Great Recession, and I could do this with Don because Don's a friend, so I had Don on the show again, and I said, Don, when we last talked, I raised these issues and you said everything was fine, and now we're in the deepest recession the country has experienced since the Great Depression, and we may be slipping toward depression. And Don's comment was, oops. And of course, his oops was for his entire profession. It wasn't just Don that missed the warning signs or the signals. I thought that was a remarkably funny moment in the history
He had
of the
strong
show.
opinions, there's no doubt.
What's that?
He had very strong opinions.
He did. He had very
Right.
strong opinions, but you know, and Don was a great guest. We would have him on at least once or twice a year. So.
You know, I'm not sure. There have been moments where I've thought, oh my gosh, that's just really interesting. But I felt like I've been educated about some issues. We did a show about emergency preparedness, like what people really need to do if they drop the bomb on Chicago, if we had a chemical leak in this area, and I mean you had to abandon. That was really interesting, I thought, because they talked about stuff I never knew about before, and so that's kind of interesting. Your humorous moment reminded me of, I did one show on recycling, and I got the 2 women on the show to lick the styrofoam peanuts, to see if they were water soluble or not.
Right.
So that was a good one.
And no one fell out.
No. Well, I have to give you the normal signal that we all know. We're toward the end of the show. So any other last kind of thought about just what the experience was for you?
You know, it was a great experience. As I said, I took it as a real responsibility. I felt a real obligation to prepare adequately for the shows. I love Northwest Indiana, as you love Northwest Indiana. That made it a very important responsibility as well. And I really appreciated all the opportunities that the station provided. It was a great experience.
Well, you set a high bar for me to follow. So when I came on, I was really pretty nervous about that, because I was like, God, Dan has done such a good job with the show and has such a high level of respect. You set the bar pretty high, so I know I had to really measure up.
You've done well.
Well, thanks, Dan, and I really appreciate you coming on. So I know you used to probably have some sort of close to your show, so how did you close the show?
Well, I did. After we did the Other Thoughts, the op-ed piece, I would turn to the camera and I would say, those are my thoughts on the matter. How about yours? And then I would invite the audience to share their thoughts, which I do hope they'll do in this case, because I think they're going to want to comment on perhaps how much older you look than I do, and so on. So I hope they'll weigh in on that.
Well, I will echo that for people to also send in their comments and to us. The email address is on your screen. So stay with us for upcoming shows. We're looking forward to seeing you again here. And until then, I'm Keith Kirkpatrick saying make a positive difference in the world today.